Hello dear learners, welcome to another session of learning. So today we're going to see the method communicative language teaching. So communicative language teaching has its origin in Britain, and it was based on the method situational language teaching, SLT, which was based on practicing the basic structure of situation based activities. So it followed the cycle of PPP, which was presentation, practice and production. So real life situations were presented to the learners, and then they had to practice those dialogues, and then they had to reproduce it. So that was the cycle that was followed in situational language teaching. And Noam Chomsky, the renowned linguist, he spoke about linguistic competence, which is linguistic competence that is possessed by native speakers. So he emphasized the need for linguistic competence among the learners of language. And he also brought forward the theory on competence and performances in language learning, which enabled other linguists to also work around this method. So the background to this method was that in the 1970s and 80s, two important social changes happened. One was the societal influence, which was a lot of migration was happening towards Europe, and many people were moving towards Europe. So there arose a need for learning foreign languages. And the second was the influence of academic. So this was basically this method was a response to traditional language teaching methods, and British linguists like D.A. Wilkins, Christopher Candlin, Keith Johnson, Henry Widdowson, Christopher Brumfitt, they all brought forward theory of language and theory of learning, which are the base for this method of communicative language teaching. So the other alternative terms by which CLT is referred to are CLT, communicative approach. And the theory of language was put forward by Del Hymes. He was an American linguist, he was a sociolinguist, anthropologist, and folklorist, and he coined the term communicative competence. So, according to him, he redefined what is meant to know a language, meaning that if you have to know the language, it is not just knowing the structure but also making use of it in a real life situation. So he introduced the idea of wider communicative competence. So it's not just mastery of structural elements, but also how you use those structures in real life situations, which is the speech domains. And he put forward the theory of communicative competence, in which a person is able to acquire the following abilities when he uses the language: whether something is formally possible, whether something is feasible, whether something is appropriate, and whether something is in fact done. So his theory primarily focused on communicative competence. Moving on, the theory of language was also propounded by Michael Halliday, a British linguist. So he spoke about how we need to study how language functions are expressed through grammar. So he put forward the theory of functions of language, and according to him, there are 7 basic functions language performs for children, especially when they're learning it as a first language. And the 7 functions of language put forward by him are the instrumental function, that is how you use the language; the regulatory function, how language is used to control behavior of people; interactional function, which is how language is used in communication, in interaction with people; and 4 is the personal function, which is using language to express personal feelings and emotions. Heuristic function of language comes as the fifth function of language, and it is using language to learn and to discover. And he also moved on to talk about the imaginative function of language and the representational function of language. So imaginative function of language is using language to create a world of imagination, and representational function is using language to communicate information. So these 7 are, according to him, the theory of language and the functions of language. And the characteristics of CLT included that language is a system of for expressing of meaning. So meaning was highlighted in this under this method, and language was also primarily used for interaction and communication. It was not just enough to know the structure of the language, but also to know how it functioned and how it can be used in communication. So that was the primary focus of CLT. So you not only need to know the grammatical and structural features, but also to categorize or functional and communicative meaning also needs to be learnt under this method. And the theory of learning, so previously we saw the theory of language, now we're seeing theory of learning is actually, it has three principles of learning that were put forward by Keith Johnson and Christopher Brumfitt. They are the communicative principle, the task principle, and the meaningfulness principle. So communicative principle, it involves activities that involve real communication from motion. So real life, how you communicate in real life is used. Next is task principle, where language is used for different tasks. So different tasks are carried out, and in the process the learner learns the language. The meaningful principle is where language that is meaningful to learn support the learning process. So whatever learning happens, that learning is very meaningful for the learner. So these are the three principles of learning according to Keith Johnson and Christopher Brumfitt. And there were other theorists also who spoke about the theory of language. There was Sandra J. Savignon, and her theory focused on the role of linguistic, social, cognitive, and individual variables in language acquisition. And the other linguists who spoke about the theory of learning are Keith Johnson and William Littlewood, and theirs was primarily on skill learning model of learning, and that is acquisition of communicative competence. And in and language is an example of skill development. So they said that language learning was a skill development activity. So these were some of the theory of learning, and the characteristics of CLT based on theory of learning are an emphasis on learning to communicate through interaction, and this interaction is done only in the target language. The mother tongue is never used for communication. And the introduction of authentic texts also are given, and that too in learning situation. And the provision for the learners to focus, it's not only on the language but also on the learning process. So the learners are also involved in the learning process, and it also involves the enhancement of learners own personal experience, because they are able to contribute towards the learning process. So their own personal experiences also come into play. And then there's always a link between what is learned in the classroom and how it is used outside the classroom. So learning does not stop within the classroom alone, but it is also extended towards its use outside the four walls of the class. So the objectives of CLT included goal of effective communication. So that was the primary goal. Then learning language by using it to communicate, which was second goal. And 3 is the focus on meaning and appropriate usage. So repetitively they focused on meaning and also usage. And both fluency and accuracy was given importance. But here fluency, under this method, fluency was given more importance. And authentic material that is based on real life situation were also introduced. So that is one of the objective. And integration of not just one skill but all the 4 skills of speaking, writing, listening, and reading were emphasized under CLT. So the components of CLT include, that is the syllabus aspect. When it comes to syllabus, it included notional functional syllabus. And this notional functional syllabus, it thoroughly focused on how language could be used in real life situation, like making examples are like making requests, apologizing, giving directions. So proper structures were taught to the students is based on the situation and how they need to use it. An example would be, for example, if you want to teach them the use of can, could, then it could be can, could, you plus the infinitive. An example, can you open the window? So these are some of the ways in which the syllabus was thoroughly focused on using language in real life situation. And the role of the learner, when it came to the role of the learner was very active, because they were able to communicate with the members of the group, and they took part in all the activities. There was interaction, there was conversation between the learners, not only between the learners but also between the teacher and the other learners. So thoroughly the learner was active. The learner was not passive, and he or she was able to contribute from their own experiences also. So the learner was thoroughly active. And when it came to the teacher was not autocratic, but instead the teacher was a facilitator. The teacher was, enabled the process of learning. And sometimes they were independent participants, meaning they were also part of the activities, and their role was that of guides, and they monitored the errors, and they also delivered positive feedback. So under this method we see it is a student friendly method, it is a learner friendly method, and it is not in control of the teacher. So we see that it's a two-way communication that happens between the learner and the teacher. And moving on to the materials used, materials like text-based materials could be used, task-based materials like cue cards, student interaction practice booklets, then activity cards could be used. And also realia, meaning material that we use in our day-to-day lives like newspapers, maps, pictures, symbols, graphs, advertisements, magazines, signs. They all could be incorporated as material that could be used for learning. So this method was a very effective method. So the techniques that could be used or adopted under CLT, like role play could be there, group work, then scavenger hunt, reasoning gaps. You could also have puzzles, games, map reading. So pair and collaborative activities should be the primary focus. So all the techniques that you use need to have not only individual learner but learners that can interact in such a way that the teacher also can be part of the learning process. So the principles of CLT included linguistic competence, socio-linguistic competence, discourse competence, and strategic competence. So all these were the principles of CLT. Also, using tasks as organizational principle was also part of it, and providing error corrective feedback was another principle under CLT, and it also promoted collaborative and cooperative learning. And so we see that a lot of learning happened under this method. And the procedure is you give a pre-task where a pre-communication activities are given, structural activities are given, and then the task is given, communication activities are given, and then it's administered, and the teacher also gets involved. So the advantages, it's a student centered method, it is task oriented, and it is also focusing on the communicative competence. So this is a very effective method. However, the disadvantage was that grammar rules were not given much importance, and because the fluency was given more importance than accuracy, the method did have its drawbacks, and learners sometimes weren't able to be as proficient because they were using only the target language and they did not have the native speakers competence. So even the teachers also found it at times difficult when they were not proficient with the language. Then the sources and equipments used needed to be very authentic, and the teacher needed to be someone who spoke the language, so a native speaker, which was a difficult task. So these were some of the disadvantages of CLT method. So I hope all of you were able to understand the communicative language teaching method, and even in our classrooms we do now incorporate the communicative language teaching method, which is still a very effective method. So thank you all for joining, and happy learning. Thank you.